When an elderly woman opened a yellowed envelope on stage, Dr. Phil did something he'd never done before. He raised his hand, looked directly at the production crew, and said one word. Stop. The cameras kept rolling, but everything else froze. The audience held its breath. The woman's hands trembled. And in that moment, everyone in the studio knew they were about to witness something that would change lives forever. This is the story of Margaret Hayes, a 78-year-old grandmother from Portland, Oregon, who came to the Dr. Phil show carrying a secret that had haunted her family for 50 years. What started as a routine taping about family estrangement became something much deeper, something that would require Dr. Phil to break every rule of television production to get to the truth. 6 weeks earlier, Margaret's grandson, David, had written to the show. His letter was simple but heartbreaking. My grandmother is dying, and she says she needs to tell the truth before it's too late. But she won't talk to anyone in the family. She'll only do it if Dr. Phil is there. Please help us. The Dr. Phil team reviewed hundreds of submissions every week, but something about Margaret's story stood out. When producers called her, she answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. Her voice was steady, but there was an urgency beneath it. I need to do this right, she told them. I need someone who won't let me back down. The moment Dr. Phil broke protocol wasn't just television history. It was the moment a family's entire foundation shifted, and nothing would ever be the same. On the day of taping, Margaret arrived at the studio 3 hours early. She wore her best cardigan, the cream-colored one her late husband had given her on their 40th anniversary. In her purse, wrapped in tissue paper, was the envelope. She had carried it with her for decades, moving it from house to house, hiding it in different drawers, always knowing where it was, never opening it in front of anyone. David arrived separately, as instructed by production. He didn't know exactly what his grandmother planned to reveal, but he knew it involved his father, Margaret's son, who had passed away 5 years earlier. The family had always sensed there was something unspoken, some shadow that followed his father throughout his life. Now maybe they would finally understand. The studio audience filed in, unaware they were about to witness something unprecedented. They expected the usual Dr. Phil format: tough questions, emotional revelations, practical advice. What they got was something else entirely. Dr. Phil walked onto the stage to his usual applause. He greeted Margaret warmly, noting her nervous energy. You've been waiting a long time to tell this story, he said, sitting down across from her. 53 years, Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The audience leaned forward. This wasn't the typical opening. Dr. Phil's expression shifted. He'd done thousands of shows, talked to countless guests, but something about the way Margaret held herself, the way her hands gripped that envelope, told him this was different. He glanced at his producers in the wings and gave them a subtle signal. Let this play out however it needs to. Margaret, Dr. Phil began, his voice gentle but direct. You told our producers you need to do this before it's too late. What did you mean by that? Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. I'm dying, Dr. Phil. Stage 4. They give me maybe 6 months. And I can't meet my maker carrying this lie. The studio went completely silent. Even the crew members, who had seen everything over the years, felt the weight of what was happening. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. What lie have you been carrying? Dr. Phil asked. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out the envelope. It was old, the paper yellowed and fragile, the edges worn from decades of handling. This, she said, holding it up, is the truth about my son. About who he really was. About what I did. Dr. Phil leaned forward. He could feel the audience behind him, everyone holding their breath, waiting. What's in that envelope, Margaret? A birth certificate, she said. But not the one everyone thinks exists. David, watching from backstage on a monitor, felt his heart start to race. A birth certificate? What did that mean? But what happened next is something no one in the room, or watching at home, saw coming. Margaret's hands shook as she held the envelope. My son David's father, his name was Thomas. Tommy. He was the light of my life, Dr. Phil. But he wasn't mine. The audience gasped. Dr. Phil held up his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. Explain that to me, he said, his voice measured and calm, giving her space to continue. In 1970, I was 19 years old. My sister, Claire, was 16. She got pregnant by a boy who left town the day she told him. My parents were strict Catholics. They said it would destroy the family, destroy Claire's future. So they made a decision. Margaret paused, tears streaming down her face. They sent Claire to live with our aunt in Montana for 9 months. And when the baby was born, I went there, stayed for 2 weeks, and came back with him. Everyone thought he was mine. Claire came home 3 months later, finished high school, went to college. She never held him again. Dr. Phil sat back slowly, processing what he just heard. This was bigger than he'd anticipated. So your son, Tommy, never knew his real mother was actually your sister? No one knew, Margaret whispered. Not my husband. Not Tommy. Not even Claire's own children. She married, had 3 kids, built a whole life. And I raised her son as my own. And Claire? Dr. Phil asked carefully. Where is she now? Margaret's face crumpled. She died 2 years ago. Breast cancer. And on her deathbed she begged me to tell the truth. She said Tommy had a right to know, even though he was gone too. She said his children, her grandchildren, deserved to know where they came from. Dr. Phil stood up. The audience watched as he walked to the edge of the stage, signaling to his producers. Hold on, he said, his voice carrying across the studio. Stop the tape. The production crew exchanged glances. Dr. Phil never stopped the taping. Not like this. He turned back to Margaret. You understand what you're about to do? Once you open that envelope, once this truth is out there, you can't take it back. I know, Margaret said, her voice stronger now. That's why I'm here. I need someone to hold me accountable. I need witnesses. Because if I do this alone, in private, I might lose my courage again. I've been losing it for 50 years. Dr. Phil looked toward the backstage area. Bring David out here. David walked onto the stage, confusion and concern written across his face. He sat down next to his grandmother, taking her hand. Grandma, what's going on? Margaret turned to her grandson, the boy she'd helped raise after his father died, and handed him the envelope. Baby, I need you to open this. I need you to see it first, before I tell the rest of the world. Because you deserve to hear this from me, not from a piece of paper. David's hand shook as he took the envelope. Dr. Phil remained standing, giving the moment the gravity it deserved. The cameras captured everything, but somehow the usual mechanics of television production faded away. This wasn't a show anymore. It was a confession, a release, a reckoning. David opened the envelope carefully and pulled out a folded document. As he unfolded it, his eyes scanned the faded type. Birth certificate. State of Montana. Mother's name, Claire Hayes. Father's name, unknown. He looked up at his grandmother, his face pale. I don't understand. Off camera, Dr. Phil made a choice no producer expected. Dr. Phil walked over to his producers again. I need everyone who isn't essential out of the studio, he said quietly but firmly. This family needs privacy for what's about to happen. Within minutes, half the crew had stepped out. The audience remained, but the usual energy of a television taping had transformed into something more intimate, more sacred. Dr. Phil had created space for truth. He sat back down, this time next to David, creating a triangle between himself, Margaret, and her grandson. Margaret, tell David what this means. And she did. She told him everything. About Claire, about the secret, about raising a child who wasn't biologically hers but whom she had loved with every fiber of her being. About the burden of the lie, how it had colored every family gathering, every holiday, every moment she'd spent with Tommy's children, knowing they were really Claire's grandchildren. Your father, Margaret said to David, her voice breaking, was the most beautiful soul I've ever known. And whether he came from my body or not doesn't change that I was his mother. But you deserve to know the whole truth. You deserve to know that Claire, the aunt you barely remember, was actually your biological grandmother. That the 3 cousins you grew up with are actually your half-aunts and uncles. David sat in stunned silence, the birth certificate still in his hands. Dr. Phil let the moment breathe, understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply bear witness. Finally, David spoke. Did my dad ever know? No, Margaret whispered. And that's my greatest regret. Claire wanted to tell him when he turned 18, but I begged her not to. I was scared he'd hate me, scared I'd lose him. So we agreed to wait. We kept waiting. And then it was too late. Dr. Phil leaned forward. Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Why now? Why did you decide to come here and do this? Margaret looked directly at him. Because I'm running out of time, and my grandson deserves to know his history. Because Claire made me promise. And because... She paused, taking a shaky breath. Because I finally realized that the truth isn't something to be ashamed of. What we did back then, we did out of love and fear and trying to protect everyone. But keeping it secret all these years, that's caused more pain than the truth ever would have. The studio was completely silent except for the quiet sound of people crying. Even the crew members were wiping their eyes. Dr. Phil stood and walked to the center of the stage. He looked at the cameras, then back at Margaret and David. I'm going to do something I don't usually do, he said. We're going to take a break. Not for commercials. A real break. Margaret, David, I want you two to have some private time with the therapists we have here. The audience and I are going to step out. And when we come back, we're going to talk about how to move forward, because that's what matters now. He turned to the audience. What you've just witnessed is real courage. This woman could have taken her secret to the grave. Instead, she chose truth. That's what we're about here. That's what matters. The audience stood and applauded as Margaret broke down completely, David holding her as she wept. Dr. Phil signaled to his team, and they cleared the studio, giving the family the space they needed. 45 minutes later they resumed. Margaret looked lighter somehow, as if a physical weight had been lifted. David sat closer to her now, their hands clasped together. Dr. Phil addressed them both. How are you feeling? Scared, Margaret admitted. But free. For the first time in 50 years I feel free. David? Dr. Phil asked. David took a deep breath. I'm processing. But I want to say something to my grandmother. He turned to face her fully. You raised my dad. You loved him. You were there for every scraped knee, every baseball game, every moment that mattered. Biology doesn't change that. You're my grandmother. Nothing in that envelope changes that. Margaret sobbed, pulling David into an embrace that seemed to contain decades of fear and relief and love all at once. Dr. Phil let them have their moment, then spoke directly to the camera. I want to talk to everyone watching at home. Families have secrets. Some are small, some are monumental like what we've heard today. But secrets have a cost. They create distance, they breed shame, they keep us isolated in our own pain. Margaret's courage today isn't just about her family. It's a reminder that truth, as scary as it is the only path to genuine healing. He turned back to Margaret. What do you want people to take away from your story? Margaret wiped her eyes and sat up straighter. I want them to know that it's never too late to make things right. That carrying shame doesn't protect anyone, it just hurts everyone. And that love, real love, isn't about biology or perfection. It's about showing up, telling the truth, and trusting that the people who matter will still be there when you do. The studio audience rose to their feet without prompting, applause filling the space with a kind of reverence rarely seen on television. Dr. Phil arranged for Margaret and David to continue working with the show's therapy team. He connected them with resources for genetic counseling, family mediation, and grief support. He also helped facilitate conversations with Claire's children, Margaret's nephew and nieces, who had suddenly learned that their cousin was actually their half-brother. In the weeks that followed, the family began the hard work of rebuilding their understanding of themselves and each other. Margaret's health continued to decline, but she spent her remaining time free of the burden she'd carried for so long. 3 months after the taping, Dr. Phil received a letter from David. Margaret had passed peacefully, surrounded by family who finally knew the whole truth. David wrote, "She died free. That's all that matters." Dr. Phil kept the yellowed envelope in his office as a reminder. Truth might break you open, but it's the only thing that can truly set you free. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten.